Hello and welcome to Career STEM Chats. In this episode, you'll be hearing a chat between Sarah Cardozo Duncan, a STEM career expert, and Dr. Monika Trzcinska. Dr. Trzcinska is co-founder and partner at Blue Star Bioadvisors, a New York-based consulting firm she's been leading since 2018. Her work focuses on helping life science companies navigate strategy and growth in a personalized, client-centered way. She brings over 20 years of experience in business development and life sciences consulting. Before starting Blue Star, she was a managing director and vice president at Turea Insights, where she led professional services and worked with companies across the biotech space. Throughout her career, she's held leadership roles in business development and marketing at organizations like Repligen, Sigma Aldrich, and Cybertex. Earlier on, she also worked in scientific publishing and academia, serving as a researcher and lecturer at Boston University and Northeastern University. Here's Sarah and Monika Trzcinska.
Monika, thank you so much for joining us tonight and agreeing to be a guest on our podcast. I really, really appreciate it because you're part of an experiment, Monika.
I appreciate that, Sarah. Thank you.
I thought you would. I thought you would. Okay, so what we're trying to do here is really to focus on the early science to mid-science career, that range, sometimes from crossing from academia into industry, sometimes academic tracks. I'm going to have somebody come and talk about that. But I think for the purposes of this evening, I think you have one of the more interesting careers that you move very quickly from the bench into the business of science. So if we could start with, how did you come to science in the first place, right? Where were you trained? And then if you could bring us through the different positions you've had, what did you do in the first position that got you the job in the second position, like the growth? What was the growth trajectory would be really interesting, and the decision making along the way.
Okay, that sounds good. Sounds good. Yeah, no, happy to do it. So I've always been interested in biology ever since I was a kid. I was actually collecting images of different animals, and when I would come across again some newspapers, I would do some clippings and create these little journals about biology. So biology was kind of my love from the get-go. But to be honest with you, when I was an undergraduate, and that was in Montreal, Canada, at Concordia University, I happened to choose an elective with a professor who to this day, I believe, still teaches, not at Concordia, but in Montreal, Jean-Paul Romprel, who taught us about the brain mechanisms of addiction and chemistry of the brain. It was kind of my introduction into the pharmacology of the brain, and I fell in love. He was a great instructor, and I realized that there's so much that we don't know about the biochemistry of the brain, and this is something I could study for kind of, to really, really spend the time learning and studying that subject. And I think that led me ultimately to apply to graduate school. After I finished my undergraduate, ended up doing a Ph.D. at University of Ottawa in Ottawa, Canada, where I studied brain mechanisms of addiction. So that was kind of an interesting topic that I think I continued to pursue after that initial introduction to this space. And it was an interesting experiment, but very isolating if you think about it, right? Every academic has to truly devote a lot of time and attention to study a very small, narrow problem in order to be really, really good at it, or in order to really discover something of substance, right? You need to kind of really develop or dedicate your career to that. And I continued to kind of explore brain mechanisms of actually malnutrition from my postdoc. And at that time, I was also teaching at BU. I taught a few undergraduate courses, kind of along the lines, trying to emulate the professor that I've had many, many years ago. So I taught perception and neuropsychology, and a course that was taught to 120 students called Drugs and Behavior, which was quite an interesting
Oh, how interesting
class. Yeah, so it was, I kind of continued on that path. And I think I was realizing as I was going through the postdoctoral training that, I really truly had to dedicate myself in order to get to the next level, which, by many standards was a tenure track position, right? At that time, I really had to dedicate my career to that one problem. And at the time when I was actually going through my training, my undergraduate and graduate training, there was very little that was really talked about in terms of alternatives careers in science. And there's in fact a book that was published by two women. I forget their names, but it's a phenomenal book that I read many years later.
Oh, Conversation on Tuesdays or something like that.
Yeah, no, it was actually alternative careers in science. I will find that I will let you know what that is, because I have forgotten the authors. But it was an interesting book that I think kind of exposed people to what are some of the alternatives in science you could pursue. Because when I was undergoing through my training, if you were to leave academia, you were leaving your brain at the door. That was kind of the perception, right? If you are truly departing the academic ivory tower, you really were kind of pursuing a lesser goal, if you will.
And you weren't a great scientist.
Exactly. You were not a great scientist. And I think I was realizing that I kept, chasing the next level, right? First, it's graduate's work, which takes a lot of time and effort, right? Then the postdoc. Okay, now the next step. I actually ended up working at Northeastern as a senior scientist, running a lab of a colleague of mine who was the dean at the time of the College of Arts and Sciences at Northeastern. And he did not want to give up his lab. So I came in to essentially write grants, supervise students, write papers, run experiments, right? Continue to be that academician. Again, in my realm of expertise. So again, drugs and behavior and mechanisms of drug addiction, kind of along the same path. And I realized that in order to get to the next level, I had to truly be open to relocating anywhere, right? In order to secure that tenure track position. And I think at that time, I was kind of coming to realization that this was not what I wanted to do, as much as I enjoyed the study of the brain and the mechanisms of addiction and running the experiments and supervising students and writing grants and writing papers. I thought the world is so much more interesting than that one problem, at least in my personal experience, right? There are many scientists who will completely dedicate themselves to a problem, to a question, and they will pursue it gladly for their entire career. And I'm not so sure if my heart wasn't in it. I don't think that was it. I just was realizing that I enjoyed being more around people, interacting with people more, and being in the lab and really pursuing one problem or sitting in my office at Northeastern late into the night writing another research paper or another grant, which we were successful actually.
Another grant.
Yes. In fact, but we were great. We were somewhat successful. And at that time, we happened to be collaborating with a young, early stage biotech company that actually hired us and paid us some money to run some experiments on their compounds that they were developing. They were dopamine transporter modulators. And so they were trying to kind of go into Parkinson's and also addiction. And we were hired as a lab to run some experiments for them. And that really introduced me to technology transfer, business development, this whole idea of you could take a scientific idea and you could start thinking about, well, okay, this is great. This is a good foundation, but could we develop a treatment down the road? Could this actually help people? And I think that was kind of an aha moment where I realized that maybe academia is not for me. So I decided to pivot, and that was a little bit like jumping off a cliff head first, because I had no mentor, I had no exposure to, like as I was saying a few minutes ago, to this alternative career in science, what I could possibly be doing with my training and expertise, applying the rigor of science, analytical thinking, right, into a different environment where I could still use my scientific training, but not necessarily in academics. And so that was an interesting transition. I kind of did it on my own. I went into completely something different, which at the time was a proteomics company that was a bioinformatics company, Proteome, which was later acquired by Insights Genomics, which is now renamed Insight Pharmaceuticals. And we were curating information about protein expression and protein function into a database. So reading scientific articles and then importing that information into a database. And I was an editor. It was interesting for a while, but also very tedious, as you can imagine, right? Right now, AI could automate probably 90% of that, right? Back then,
in about 30 seconds.
yes, yes, exactly. Back then, we were reading copious amounts of scientific literature and then incorporating, right, pulling the right information from those papers into the database that we were curating at the time. The idea was to help companies figure out how to maybe develop an agent, an asset for a druggable target. That was basically kind of the idea behind the creation of this database. So very different from the world of academia. And there were moments where I was thinking to myself, what have I done? You know, have I made the right decision, right? But it actually continued to expose me to the world of industry, right? And a very different way of thinking, where there are many people coming from kind of, again, that scientific training that had very different or varied backgrounds in scientific training, creating that product, which was the database, right? So that was kind of an interesting story, I think, to some extent, because again, it taught me how science could be utilized in a different setting, right? Not outside of academia. That was kind of the goal, basically. So to make a long story short, through some personal changes, birth of my son, and a little bit of a hiatus, I then was in a situation where Proteum actually was acquired. There was a layoff. So that also was an interesting, lesson, right? Where in academia, once you demonstrate success, there is somewhat, to some extent, job security, or at least it used to be many, many years ago.
Used to be.
Yeah, used to be. And now in industry, right, you could be exposed to, a layoff, right? Not to the fault of your own, 300 people in the same day, and you just happen to be in that group, and that's the way it goes. Yep. So I was searching for an alternative and ended up working as a manager of business development for Sigma Aldrich, which was in Natick. There was a small group called Sigma RBI, and that continued to kind of expose me to business development, to be honest, because we were trying to read literature again and study science, but from kind of the desktop research kind of perspective, right, as opposed to the lab.
Yeah.
Where we had to create or actually verify whether there was intellectual property and whether there was chemical synthesis feasibility to synthesize small molecules just for research reagent use, so that researchers, when they opened the Big Red, it used to be the catalog of Sigma Aldrich, would find out if there was a dopamine duty antagonist could, for example, be purchased and then used in their lab as an agent. So we would constantly be hunting for new molecules for research use. Cool. So it was an interesting kind of work again, because it was a little bit of tech transfer. We had to talk to various institutions to try to secure licenses and advise the chemistry department what molecules they should synthesize and what products should make it to the catalog. It was a lot of fun, right? And it was very much business development, like those kind of small licenses, again, kind of continue to introduce me to the business of science and how the scientific knowledge kind of ties to business development. So that was a lot of fun for a while. And I think I reached a point where I was getting a little antsy. I realized that there was more that I could be doing with that knowledge, right? I was kind of introduced to it at Northeastern when we had the tech transfer kind of agreement with that early stage biotech company. Now I was exposed to it at Sigma. And I was realizing that, maybe there's more to it. Maybe there's truly an actual molecule or actual program that could help someone, or could develop, we could develop a medicine, right, for human use.
Yes.
That's where I was going with this.
Sort of the translational aspect.
Exactly, the translational aspect. Yes, yes. And I think I was realizing that it's all fine and good, right, to study a lot of these problems in isolation and in depth. But at the end of the day, for what purpose, right? And, at that time, I knew enough about human conditions and diseases and medicine where, I used to joke with my colleagues, I know enough to be dangerous, but I'm not a physician, right? So, you read enough to kind of say, know, if I knew more, I would probably be able to diagnose. I don't know that, but I know enough to know what questions to ask or what questions I should probe on, because I know, I have some basis, right, of that knowledge. So So I ended up working, at Repligen, which is, one of the oldest, actually, it's kind of funny, one of the oldest biotech companies in the Boston area.
I
Uh,
didn't know that.
yeah, they were one of the first few that were actually categorized as biotech. And at that time, they were producing many, many years ago, they were the first company that would produce protein A, which to this day is used in purification of monoclonal antibodies. But the company also had an ambition, and they had a few assets that they in-licensed from various sources where they were developing treatments for central nervous system disorders. And I was brought in as a director because of my neuroscience background. And the idea was, again, to out-license some of those programs and then also look for opportunities to in-license. And what was fascinating is, and I'm going to date myself because back then, one of the programs we in-licensed, which is kind of my claim to fame, was in spinal muscular atrophy. That molecule has died on the vine. But back then, remember, now we have Zolgensma and, small molecules, right, for the treatment of and Spinraza for the treatment of SMA. Back then, there was nothing. That was a death sentence, right? If you had SMA1, if you happened to have a child with SMA1, that was usually the end of the world. And if you had a child with SMA2, you knew that that person would become disabled very quickly. It was a tragic story, and there was absolutely nothing on the market. So and that was the first kind of, I think, introduction when we licensed that program for families of spinal muscular atrophy. It was a non-for-profit organization. It was the first kind of realization, and I thought, oh my God, this is real. Like, this is for real. This is what people
Oh,
do.
real? Oh, because you had the interaction with the patient.
Yes, yes, we actually
Oh,
interviewed.
oh,
We
that's
didn't quite.
interesting.
I didn't have direct connection with the patient, but we spoke to KOLs, key opinion leaders,
Right.
who were the select few in the United States. You could really count them on the fingers of your, basically, there were maybe 10 of them, right? That were truly experts in the disease, and they would be the champions or the PIs on any clinical trial, right? If you were to ever develop an asset. So we were talking to them, and we were talking to the families of spinal muscular atrophy, which is a non-for-profit patient advocacy group, which was really a patient voice, if you will,
Right.
right? So it was really this eye-opening because, it was a very small example of, my goodness, this is what people do for a living. They actually develop treatments to treat these horrific diseases, right? That are often a death sentence, especially the rare monogenic, genetic diseases, right? That affect the central nervous system. So it was fascinating work. We did great, we did a great deal. That molecule died through development. It had nothing to do with the actual, licensing experience. Was actually very well executed. But as is often the case in our industry, right? Some programs are successful as others are not. And look at many years later, right? There are others who followed, and now we have, two genetic treatments, oligonucleotide and the gene therapy, plus a small molecule, right? To treat this
Wow.
disease, which is
Wow.
fantastic, right? Things have
Right.
changed. I feel like I was part of that story, right? Even though we were we were not successful in developing that asset all the way through to approval. So to make a long story short, my God, it's so funny as I'm talking about this, I'm realizing I have been in this industry for a while because I
You've
even
been in
talking
for
to
quite a
you,
while,
Sarah and Ruby, you know?
but you want to know something, Monica? I mean, I think your story is very interesting because you've used your science, right, in the two jobs that you've explained to us so far. You've
Yeah.
used your science because you love your science, but you moved it into that aha moment
Hmm.
of the translational piece
Yes.
and the impact that you could actually make instead of, maybe an academic career where you would publish in journals, very prestigious journals, I'm sure, but the impact isn't the same because academia isn't
Right.
developing therapeutics.
Right, that's true. That's true. Sometimes they do, right? There are some companies,
Yeah,
as we all know, that get spun out of, tech transfer
correct.
offices at academic institutions. But I think there's a very far few in between.
Yeah,
And to your point, Sarah, it's true. The contribution is different, right, in academics. In contribution, oftentimes people teach, and some of them teach very well. Others cannot teach, right? They don't do it very well. They have great knowledge, but they don't know how to express it. But you can contribute to society in different ways. But I think I realized that I just did
it
not want to
wasn't,
study one problem for the rest
and
of
it
my career.
wasn't, it wasn't for you.
Yes, exactly.
It
Exactly.
just wasn't for you. It could be right for the person in the bay beside you, but it wasn't for you. That's all.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't for me. It wasn't for me. I
And
wanted to
how
be more of a
wonderful,
generalist. Yeah.
and how wonderful to discover that before it
Yeah.
was too late.
That's
You know,
true. That's true.
because
That's
I
true.
mean, look at the so take us through, because I just think that, and what were the sort of lessons that you learned about business development along the way?
That's a very good question. I think that business development takes a lot more diplomacy than I think people realize. People sometimes don't realize that in order to do a successful deal, it is not a function of you winning, that both parties have to win. So the person who's, for example, out licensing the IP around a certain program or asset has to feel like they've won also at the end of the day, even though they may be selling an asset for financial reasons or to truly, right, find a partner to develop it further, right? But it has to be a win-win situation. It cannot be a win-lose situation. So I think that was the first lesson. It takes a long time to do business development. It takes a lot of patience. So if you're not a patient person, if you cannot be in it for the long haul, that's not for you, because there are months, sometimes it can be months before you actually close on a deal. When we did that deal with families of spinal muscular atrophy, it was almost a year,
Yeah.
right? Because we were going through conversations with these key opinion leaders. We were trying to figure out the commercial model, right? We were trying to figure out how far the company could take this before then finding a bigger pharma partner. There were a lot of questions in play. So it was a very complex process. And I think that also was a very, good lesson, right? And it's not straightforward. It's not simple. Just because you have one party that's willing to sell something and another party that's willing to buy doesn't mean that
It's
this is
going to
going
work.
to be a slam dunk, right? This is going to be an easy process. So I think it's a cumbersome, complex process, but with high risk, high reward. Kind of
And
like our industry, if you think about it.
right, exactly. But do you think that the academic training and the resilience and the persistence that you need to get through both PhD and postdoc, depending on your advisor, of course,
Mm-hmm.
seems to me like that critical thinking, that analytical thinking, was a natural crossover for you into business
Yeah.
development.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
that's very well said. Actually, you said it perfectly. I couldn't have said it better myself. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I think, many people who have gone through graduate work, right, can attest to the fact that it was grueling and long. And sometimes, right, you had to adjust experiments, you have to shift gears, right? There's a lot of resilience and persistence, right, that has to happen in order for you to be successful. This is just nature of science, right? It's not easy by any stretch of the imagination. You have to kind of devote yourself to it. But you're absolutely right. I think those are the very same skills that then can be applied when you're in that translational mode, right? When you have to kind of figure out how you can then apply this knowledge in a different environment. You're absolutely right. That academia gives you great training for that.
Yeah, great training.
Yeah.
Great. And credibility, right?
Yes.
Because you have a lovely PhD after your name. So when you're doing business development, you're coming in as a scientist,
Right.
who happens to be in business development.
Yeah. That's true. That's true. That's exactly, no, that's very well said. Exactly. Using that scientific knowledge not in the lab, but applying it in a different setting. Yeah, you're
Yeah, for
absolutely right.
sure.
You're
For
absolutely
sure.
right.
And then bring us through the next, because you went from that, I think, to from Sigma, then you went to
Repligen, and then I left and went to Torreya Insights, which was another interesting story.
So let's hear that story.
Yeah, so that was another shift, another kind of transition.
And why the transition? That's always like
Yeah.
people, when do you know it's time to transition?
Yeah. So again, it was forced upon me because the company was completely out licensing all the CNS, or central nervous system assets, and becoming a truly bioprocessing company. So it was a complete shift in business model, and there were a few of us again who could not have a home anymore because our expertise laid in different area, right? So again, I found myself in that transition to say, aha, okay, so time to find another opportunity. So I happen to know a good colleague of mine who is a banker to this day, who founded Torreya Partners, which was an M&A advisory. They got sold a few years ago to Stifel, which is also a bank. And a colleague of mine basically said, listen, I'm starting this kind of an outfit of Torreya Partners called Torreya Insights. We're trying to develop this database of actionable assets, in other words, small molecules, biologics, right, that people can license. Again, this business development aspect. But we're also trying to create some help for the very early stage companies that are too early for our appetite. In other words, as a bank, we're not going necessarily to transact, right, with them. But you guys could develop a consultancy around business development and could assist those companies in kind of building their story, positioning the assets, with the idea that maybe one day, right, they'll be able to present it to a partner or find financing, or maybe we could even take them on down the road, right? So we were starting to do a little bit of that early stage business development while we were also trying to develop another product at the same time under this very new founded umbrella called Torreya Insights. And that was an interesting experience, a great, made a lot of good. I think this was the first time where I really kind of broadened my horizons. I met a lot of people, a lot of conferences, exposed myself to many different ideas and many different assets and many different companies, and created really kind of from the ground up a small team of consultants at the time who were very focused again on business development, but this time not for one company, but for several companies, right? Essentially helping them kind of spearhead their development and giving them
almost like an incubation kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. That's a perfect way of putting it. It's almost like an incubation, and also giving them a bit of advice by doing a bit of market research, opportunity assessment, to help them not have that typical opening slide in their corporate deck that says, if we are successful, and that success could be defined as proof of concept at phase 2 or successful approval, right? That we're going to own 10% of the $20 billion market. And of course, everybody who reads those slides, right, goes, yeah, right. So we wanted to make their story credible, right? So they don't come across like they don't know what they're talking about. Because oftentimes these were very smart people, highly dedicated to science, right? Kind of going back, very, very smart, dedicated people who were truly bought into the idea, but they had no perspective of the commercial applications of their idea, of their asset. So we were kind of brought in to give them a bit of a reality check of what that could look like. And, we talked to physicians, we talked to payers, we got them kind of a little bit of a reality check to say, yes, you could have a percentage of the market, but it's not going to be 20%, right? And here are the reasons why. And you can think about those reasons now as you are trying to raise capital to develop this asset. Before you spend $30 million, you may want to rethink your clinical trial, or you may want to rethink how you think about this story, so that when you actually start developing it, you will be much more successful. So that was kind of our, reason for existing.
So you were also involved in the messaging, right?
Yes. We were involved in messaging, exactly. How you can message the science, but now with a lens of commercial and business questions, right? So kind of, with that. So as we were doing that work at Torreya Insights, Torreya Partners were changing strategy. We were realizing that there were two kind of avenues that the company was pursuing, and we truly wanted to build a consultancy around this. So when a colleague of mine, who's now my business partner, one of two, because there's three of us who are partners at Blue Star Bioadvisors, the current consultancy I co-own. When one of them came on board, Darren Esco, we realized we had a great situation going. We could truly develop a consultancy, right? We were already helping companies from the business development perspective and messaging, like you said, a little bit of marketing, but we could do much more than that. There are many other services that, that consulting firms provide: pipeline prioritization, strategy work, financial analyses. We could kind of package it all together and offer it under new umbrella. So we spun out successfully. And if somebody many years ago told me I was gonna be a business owner, I would have laughed them out of the door, like, out of the way. I was like, there's no way, right? It basically, the situation created itself, and it was too good to pass up. I couldn't say no, right? So overnight, well, not overnight, it took us several months to register the company, open the doors, do all the paperwork, right? But we were successfully transitioned. We were 4 people when we first started in January 2018, and now we're
Wow.
20 people.
And now
So
you're how many?
20.
Wow, that's a tremendous growth.
Yeah. And we're continuing to grow. We actually just hired a consultant who's going to start with us next spring. So, it's been a labor of love. It's been tough, but we have truly been growing the company. And again, science is on the basis of everything that we do every day, right? Every single consulting project we starts with scientific questions. It's whether it's oncology or central nervous system or a rare disease in respiratory condition. We look at the science before we start building the story, right? Before we go out to physicians and ask questions about asset or treatment paradigm or unmet needs, right? We start with the science. So science has never left my vernacular or my kind of professional world. Is just I have built additional, I've added tools into the toolkit, right? If you
Oh, I
will.
think you've added not just tool, I think you've added and sharpened tools in your toolkit because you really know what you're doing, Monika.
I hope so.
Well, no, but I mean, in what you've sort of related to us this evening, the jobs that you've had have always been, maybe the company not successful, but you've been successful,
I've
right?
tried.
I've
Yeah.
been in a couple of layoffs, and that always happens. It sort
Yeah.
of brings you up a little bit, I suppose. But how do you find entrepreneurship? I think is the question because
Yep.
working for other people,
Yep.
now you have, the responsibility of paying 20 people underneath you.
Yes. 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 You know what? I think it's interesting. I think it helps to have business partners who kind of row the boat in the same direction. You have to like working, people like doing business with people they like, right?
Yeah.
And it's true for business development, and it's true when you form a partnership. I'm going to be blunt. It's like no assholes allowed. I know it's blunt way of stating it,
Be
but it's
blunt. I'm blunt. Be
but
blunt.
it's true. It's true, right? People have to get along. They have to, even if there's conflict, they have to know how to resolve it amicably. They have to figure out how to be basically mature. I don't know how else to put it. It's maturity, right? You kind of have to, because when you're growing a business, it's never going to be straightforward and easy from the get-go, right? We had at the very beginning of our existence, we had one client. It was a big client who was not paying us on time. And literally my business partner and I had to defer our salaries because we had to pay our team, right? The team came first. So that was an eye-opening, right? This was
Yeah.
what was keeping us up at night. And of course I have my own bills, I have mortgage to pay. Like this is, we're not independently wealthy. We need to, work for a living, right? So this was an interesting experience, but that's a very good question that you've asked. Like, how do you find it entrepreneurship? And I don't think it happens overnight. I think you have to be willing to take the risk. You have to probably realize that there's more benefit than the downside, right? The upside has to be bigger than the downside for various reasons, whether because you believe in a mission company, you believe in the person or people with whom you're partnering, right? There has to be more goodness than the struggle. And I think that entrepreneurship happens over time where you basically realize, okay, we have to register the company. Then we have to figure out how to form an operating agreement. Okay, we need a lawyer for that. Okay. So the lawyer gives us some feedback, but then we have to, kind of form the structure of the company. You learn every step of the way. And it's hard to put it in kind of a concise, like, here's a recipe, right? Because every story is different. But I think you have to be open to learning, and you have to be open to be wrong, right? And then
And
adjust as you go.
and I think you have to welcome risk.
Yeah.
Like you have to like risk.
Yes. Yes.
right? And
Yes.
and so that's very entrepreneurial, or people who really will jump into the deep end of the pool and say,
Yes.
we'll give it a try. Let's see if we can swim.
Yes.
And
You
it
know,
sounds,
yeah.
go ahead. Go ahead.
No, the one, you're right. You're right. But you know what? The risk can also be somewhat de-risked, because you're right. If we were starting from scratch, if I was moving straight from academia to forming a consulting company, I would have failed miserably because I wouldn't have had those experiences. We already did a little bit of that consulting framework. We knew we had some clients that we could take with us as we started our own company. It wasn't like we were completely going from scratch. And I think that was a way to de-risk the story somewhat. It wasn't completely like we were starting with a blank slate, right? Which I think is often what's highly risky. So I think you're absolutely right, but I think you can mitigate that risk.
Correct.
If you can do this successfully, right, it will probably minimize the number of sleepless nights you're going to have.
Maybe, maybe one or two.
Maybe one or two, yeah.
One or two, that would be enough. And then it's such an interesting perspective. It's just so interesting. And so if somebody wanted to start, like you just hired a consultant, like what are the backgrounds that you look for when you hire consultants into your firm?
That is a very good question, and I think it depends on the level. So at a very young level, or the very beginning level, which is an associate consultant or consultant, we're looking for oftentimes students who are literally finishing out of their bachelor's or master's, and they're finding their first job with us. So we're looking for people who are, again, highly analytical thinkers, team players, pleasant personalities, people who can work hard and play hard. I know it sounds very cliche, but it's so true, right? Somebody who has a hobby, but who also understands how are they going to have to work in order to excel themselves and help the team, right? People who do have scientific training, right? So those very young students early on kind of have to have a bit of that kind of gestalt, this combination of skill set. The people who are more at mid-manager level, we're looking for folks who are kind of dedicated to this world, because many people start in consulting and they move to business development, corporate development, right? Other areas. I kind of went the other way, right? I did those things and then I went to consulting. But so there has to be some dedication, and I think there has to be some willingness to work in very I would say short-term rapid fire projects, because business development, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, takes forever. Consulting projects usually take 6 to 8 weeks. Yes, we have had some projects that are much longer and much shorter, but that's on average. You start not knowing much, and you learn quite a bit in 6 weeks. And then you have to, on top of it, you're learning and you're trying to deliver analysis to the client. It's kind of a double whammy, right? So your brain is firing on all cylinders. But it does expose you to many, many different problems, and many, not just scientific problems, but also many different companies, right? And that diplomacy you learn in business development serves you very well, because we have a variety of clients. We have had situations where a chief business officer needed the analysis and he or she completely understood what we were doing, but the chief commercial officer was at kind of butting heads with the chief business officer, who was our handler, right? So we had to manage the person to whom we sold the project, while we also had to handle that person who was like, is this group and why did we hire them to do this work, right? And that takes some diplomacy. It takes some strategic thinking, right? And we have been very successful. So you have to, again, be willing to kind of, not let your feathers be ruffled. You have to take the heat sometimes. Swallow your pride, be professional. And it's just, and a little bit of that is frankly how we need to work in life anyway. No matter, you don't have to be a consultant to do that, right? We need to do that with each other. But I think in consulting that becomes very, very true.
Well, it's crucial. I mean, it's, it's relationship sales.
Yes.
Right? What it really comes down to.
Exactly.
Years and years and years ago, I was in New York and I went to so many sales training. I could probably train people. Well, I did train people in sales, actually, when I think about that. But it was, people buy from people they like, because if they like you, they tend to trust you.
Yes.
So when I was training people, I would say you have to go in and make friends. It's
Mm-hmm.
not about the first sale of business. You
Yep.
have to start at the beginning, find out what you have in common, find out this.
Exactly.
Lots of prompts, read stuff, hobbies, whatever you need to do to
Yep.
start to build a relationship with that person.
Exactly.
They're not
You're
going to buy
absolutely
from you.
spot on.
They're
Yep.
not going to buy from you the first time unless you're selling them.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. And that takes time. That takes time, right? They have to build those relationships. And yeah, it can be as simple as talking about their kids' games or your spouse hobbies. Like it gets to that level, right? Because again, to your point, people like doing business with people they like and they can relate to, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
always. As long as your product is good,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
As long as your
Exactly.
product is good.
Yes.
What,
Absolutely.
what advice? So, we're looking at this podcast. I may be looking at wrong because I think maybe everybody will listen to it, but I'm really targeting the early career to mid-career. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that you've had such a bold career in science and have been in so many other people's businesses, right? The knowledge that you have must be exponential at this point, right? And as
100%.
a scientist, you're a lifelong learner anyway, so it
Mhm.
fits. But what advice would you give to somebody who is considering business consulting? Do you think that's something that you should do and go, well, you're hiring people with undergraduate degrees or just some graduate degrees. Do you think people should have more of a pharma biotech experience before they come to a consulting company? Or do you think they can come right out of academia and go into consulting? That's
I
the
think they
question.
can, and we have hired some folks who have come again from academia. And I think it depends if they're just beginning to come in and want to get their feet wet to figure out, is this something I would like? Because sometimes people don't know, right? Then I think coming in early makes sense because you
Yeah,
learn the methodologies, you learn the approaches, you get exposed through your partners or your principals or people who are managing projects to clients. You get to hear how they talk, what questions they ask, how to do the analysis, what are some of the challenges. It kind of exposes you, is this the world I want to live in, right? And I think at that level, it's probably better to grow this organically. And especially if you have an aptitude for sales and you like people, that can really set you on a great exponential growth. I have seen it with people, right? Or you can come in at a mid-level, right, where you've kind of been, to your point, exposed to some industry and you're coming at a different level. Now, you may come with certain biases or you may come with certain kind of perception of the industry, but you're also bringing that wealth of knowledge that if you've already worked in that industry, you have the connections, right? So you can kind of step into more of that managerial and selling role because you've kind of been around the block once or twice, right? So there's no right path. There are just different paths that people can
right.
take, right? Yeah.
And then just a curiosity question, because I'm a curious person, is when you're hiring, what's the knockout, right? What does that candidate say that you say, oh no, we're not hiring this person?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think it's anything that they say. So what we normally do through our interview process, we give people a case to do,
Right.
which we give them prompts and say, here's a problem, and we give them enough so that they know how to do the research and go and find this on their own. It's not impossible. If you actually spend the time doing the case, you can do very well. But the case is important because oftentimes people are great like this, right? When they're talking on Zoom or in person over coffee, they're very personable, they're smart, they're eloquent, right? The question is, can they do the work?
Yeah.
That's the next test. And some people put a lot of attention into actually creating a great case. They spell check. I know it sounds funny, but it's as simple as that. They have uniform fonts. They quote references where appropriate. They actually dig deeper. They try to figure out, okay, if I had access to maybe primary research, how would this story change, right? I base this analysis on these sources, and here's what I'm coming up with, right? Based on the prompt that you guys have given me. Like people really spend a lot of time thinking about it. And when they do, we're like, and the personality checks and the referencing checks, we're like, okay, this is a great person to consider.
Perfect.
But there are people who will have excuses. Oh, I didn't have time. I couldn't really, I don't have the resources you guys have, so I couldn't truly come up with the right answer. And we're not looking for the right answer. We're looking for a thought process. How do
Well,
you
and
actually,
a
yeah,
thought process and a commitment.
yes, yes. Either you're serious or you're not. And then there are
Right.
people who really are serious, and it shows. And you can say, okay, you're going to apply the same work ethic to the work when you actually work on a project, right? Versus sometimes missing a lot and not doing really a very good, good job, right, on the case. Yeah.
And I would imagine it also has to do with the communication and interpersonal skills.
Yes.
Certainly in consulting, they have to be better than average because you have to be able to send them out to clients.
Yes, yes.
And if they
Or
can't
give
get
them
along with the
client
clients, good
exposure.
luck.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. The one advice that I would give to someone who is in academia or is interested in consulting, there are a lot of academic organizations who have consulting clubs, right?
Yes.
And I think that if you can get into a club like this and actually do a project under the auspice, of course, of your organization, right, with supervision of someone who's done it before, that's a great way of finding out, do I really like this? Can I do this? Am I interested in doing something like that before making that leap? And
Yes.
some of the candidates, many in fact, that we've hired have had some exposure to a consulting club or some consulting, even internship
Right.
before they considered applying to work with us. And I think those people are usually the ones that tend to be kind of the winners because we already know that they can master this. They know that can be good at it, right? And they know how to communicate from the get-go, to your point. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Okay. Anything else? Any other words of wisdom? Any I
Wow.
think that what I'm taking away is your self-awareness. And in a day that going to the dark side was not a good thing. Yet that's where you went because you knew you didn't want to be on the bench the rest
Yeah.
of that just
It's
wasn't
hard.
you as a scientist.
Yeah.
No, I think the work that you're doing is equally as hard because now you have to go, it's a hit, right? And if you don't hit it right, they're not going to hire you back.
That's true. That is true.
So it's very quick. 6 to 8 weeks is a very quick kind of turnaround,
Yes,
especially when you look at an academic, which is looking
that's
at
true. Takes years to do an
2.5 years to
experiment or
3 years
months.
to publication, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's true. That is true. But remember, we're not doing this. Usually we're doing it as a team, right? There's usually 3 or 4 of us working on a problem for a client, right? But I think words of wisdom, what I think is important, and this is not just true for work in academia, but life in general. I think having a strong support network, personal support network, whether it's a spouse or a parent or a friend or a sibling, right, or a mentor, is important because we all gonna doubt ourselves, right, as humans. And you need to kind of have some kind of a ability to brainstorm with someone and
Yep.
use them as a soundboard, right? If you don't have that, you kind of in your own silo, churning your own ideas in your own head that may or may not be the right ones, right? When you're making career decisions. So having a strong network, I think, is important. And if you don't have it in the personal life, search for it, right? Find a mentor, find a friend, find someone like yourself, for example, right? Who provide
Or
people.
find a club.
Or find a club. Exactly.
Or even, go back to your alum, right?
That's a great idea.
There are just so many ways in terms of those connections. Oh, I
Yes.
know there was one other question because you said, you hire people to sort of try them out or for them to see if this is something for you. And my sort of business head goes, wait a minute. Are you going to lose money in investing in training and then they leave? I mean, is that just
there's a very perceptive of you, Sarah. That's true. And I think, that's what was kind of surprising to me coming from business development, because in consulting, it's almost expected. And most consultants, especially when they're early stage consultants, they will stay with the firm for 2-3 years and then they'll move on. And it's almost expected. You train them, they learn, and then they leave into 3 years. But it's kind of, and frankly, we've actually retained our team for the most part longer than that, which is very surprising. I think it speaks to the fact that we're trying to work very hard to build that culture.
Yes.
But normally that's expected, right? So I think it's just part of this industry because I remember in
Yes.
business development, right? Once you start, you're kind of expected to stick around and then progress, kind of like from an associate director to a director to a VP, right? You kind of
Right.
progress, through those ranks. So it's a little different and it's a little surprising, but I think because of the exposure to so many projects and ideas and clients and therapeutic areas, and it really sets someone
Oh,
for the next kind of step in their career. And that's why
for
I think
the
people,
rest of their lives. I
yeah.
think consulting, I had one client really early on that went to BCG, this is why I asked you before, has a summer program. So they can look at people and then the people that are interested in consulting go through the program. And at the end, they either want it or they don't want it, right?
Okay.
And they can
Yeah.
go on. So that's sort of where the choices are a little different, which, but also those companies have built in burnout programs.
Interesting.
Oh, you didn't know? Oh,
No, I did not know.
oh, absolutely. They have burnout programs. Burnout after a year, burnout after 2 years. Because I was
Wow.
working with somebody who ended up at one of the consulting firms and total burnout after year one. Didn't
Wow.
know what we were going to, and I said, well, what we need to do is we need to go and ask the other consultants who are still in the company or people that
Yeah.
were in the company that left and
Yeah.
ask them what they think about you leaving after a year. And everybody came back and said, you have to stay 2 years. And so he did, and the next project was fascinating. And then he went off I was there for 3 or 4 years. And then he went off, he became a chief of staff, and his career has just flourished because I think the exposure you get in consulting is like nothing else.
Yeah. Yes, I totally agree. I totally agree. Yeah, that is true. That is true. That's true. Yep.
Good, good, good. Anything else, Monica? This has been so much fun.
Probably also, you know what? The only other thought I have is that, people sometimes I think give up too easily or too quickly. You have to have grit. And yes, I think there's a balance to know when you've put a lot of attention and it's time to move on and when you could still give a little bit more. And I think building and learning how to have grit is also something that I think it's good to teach the young generation. That it comes with experience. It's easier for people at our level to say that, right? When you're 20 something, it is very hard to kind of conceptualize what that means. But we have grit, right?
Well, I think the younger generation has grit as well. It's just that they have a view that's somewhat different, right?
That's fair. That's
Right?
fair.
There's
Yeah.
transparency issues. There's
We've talked about that. Yeah.
right? There are also the kids that were in COVID that were some of them couldn't even re-enter.
I know.
Right. So that generation really was, but fascinating and full of information and questioning, right? Just because you say it doesn't mean it's true.
That's true.
Right.
That's true.
And I love that, right? I love the questioning, the questioning and the sort of state that they're in that, they don't really, they're more global citizens than we ever were, even though
That is true.
even though the both of us came from different countries, right?
Yes, yes.
These
You're right. No, that's true. And I think they're exposed to many more tools than we wish we had, right?
Yes.
But I just hope they know how to use those tools. But anyway, there are all of smart people out there, but you're right. Pandemic was quite something. And I can see that in my own son, who's now in graduate school. And I know that it's been tough for that generation for sure.
Really tough on that generation.
Yeah.
And they're yummy.
Yeah.
I like their points of view. So let's say thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great to talk to you.
Unless you had another question for me.
No, I don't. This was great. Thank you for letting me kind of be part of this project of yours. I love to see what's next and happy to contribute in any shape and form. If you have any more questions, both Sarah, let me know.
I will. And thank you again. And I'll see you soon.